The telegram crumpled in Zelda Fairmont's hand as she stood on the weathered platform of Prescott, Arizona's railway station in 1883. Her single carpetbag at her feet and her heart somewhere back in the dusty town she was determined never to see again. She had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, watching the morning sun climb over the distant mountains, painting the rough landscape in shades of gold and copper. The train would arrive in another 10 minutes, according to the station master who'd passed by with a friendly nod. 10 more minutes in this town that had taken everything from her. 10 more minutes before she could leave behind the memories of her father's death 3 months ago, the creditors who'd seized their small ranch, and the suffocating sympathy of neighbors who meant well but understood nothing of her fierce need to escape. At 22 years old, Zelda had already buried both parents, lost her childhood home, and learned that survival meant making hard choices. The telegram had come from her mother's sister in San Francisco, a woman she barely remembered, but who had offered her a position managing the books for her import business. It was not the life Zelda had imagined for herself, growing up on Arizona rangeland with the scent of sage and the sound of cattle in her blood, but it was a future. It was something other than the wreckage of her past. She did not hear the boots on the platform behind her until a voice, rough and warm as desert wind, spoke her name, Zelda. She turned, and there he was. Garrett Ashford, the man who had worked her father's ranch for the past 4 years, who had stayed on even when there was barely money to pay him, who had been there the day her father died and had helped dig the grave with his own hands. He stood with his hat in his hands, his dark hair falling across his forehead, those green eyes that had always seemed to see too much fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Garrett," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer, and she could see the dust on his clothes, the sheen of sweat on his brow. He'd ridden hard to get here. "Heard you were leaving, heard it was today. News travels fast." She tried to sound indifferent, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the carpetbag. "Too fast for me, apparently. I only found out an hour ago when I stopped by the mercantile." He glanced at the tracks stretching east toward the rising sun, then back at her. "You really going to San Francisco?" "Yes." Just like that. Without saying goodbye, the accusation in his voice stung because it was fair. She had avoided him for the past 2 weeks, ever since she'd made her decision. Avoided him because she knew that looking into his eyes would make leaving harder, and leaving was already the hardest thing she'd ever done. "I thought it would be easier this way," she said quietly. "Easier for who?" He moved closer still, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent of him, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. "Zelda, you cannot just run away from everything." Her temper flared, the same fire that had gotten her into trouble more than once. "I'm not running away, I'm making a choice. There's nothing left for me here, Garrett. The ranch is gone. My father is gone. What exactly would you have me stay for?" The words hung between them, sharp and painful. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. In the distance, she could hear the train whistle, still miles away but approaching. Time was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Don't go," he said finally, and his voice had changed, dropped lower, become something raw and honest that cut through her defenses like a knife. "Or if you have to go, then don't go without me." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What? You heard me." He stepped even closer, so close now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Don't go without me. If you're leaving, if you're determined to start over somewhere else, then let me come with you. Let me be part of that new life." Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. Garrett, that's insane. You have work here. You have a life. I have a job I can find anywhere and a room above a stable, he said. And there was something fierce in his expression now, something that had been building for longer than just this morning. The only thing that's kept me in Prescott for the last 4 years is standing right in front of me, and if she's leaving, then there's not a damn thing here worth staying for. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. She could feel its approach in the trembling of the platform beneath her feet. "You don't mean that," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew she was wrong. She could see the truth of it in every line of his body, in the way he looked at her as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "I've never meant anything more in my life." He reached out and took her free hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I know you're grieving. I know you've lost so much. And I know I'm just a ranch hand with no property and not much money to my name. But I'm good with horses and cattle, and I can do honest work anywhere. I can make a living in California or anywhere else you want to go. What I cannot do is stay here without you. What I cannot do is let you walk out of my life without telling you that I've been in love with you for 3 years, and I'll go wherever you go if you'll have me." The world seemed to have stopped turning. Everything had narrowed down to the touch of his hand, the sound of his voice, the impossible words he was saying. 3 years. He'd loved her for 3 years and never said a word. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out broken, confused. "Your father had just lost your mother. You were grieving. And then, when enough time had passed that I thought maybe I could speak, he got sick, and you had enough to worry about without a hired hand complicating things." He squeezed her hand gently. "And maybe I was a coward. Maybe I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now, like I've grown a second head." Despite everything, despite the chaos of emotions swirling through her, she almost laughed. "I don't think you have a second head. That's a start, I suppose." His mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Zelda, I know this is sudden. I know I'm asking for something you might not be ready to give. But that train is coming and I cannot let you get on it without knowing the truth. I love you. I've loved you through your mother's death and your father's illness and the loss of the ranch. I've loved you through watching you try to be strong for everyone else while you were breaking inside. And I'll love you in San Francisco or anywhere else if you'll let me. Just don't go without me." The train was visible now, a dark shape growing larger on the horizon, trailing smoke against the pale morning sky. She had maybe 5 minutes before it pulled into the station. 5 minutes to make a decision that would change everything. She looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, rough from years of hard work. She thought about the past 4 years, about all the times Garrett had been there. Not just working, though he'd done that faithfully, but there, in the small moments. Bringing her mother wildflowers he'd found on the range. Sitting with her father on bad nights, playing cards and telling stories to ease the pain. Fixing the porch steps without being asked. Teaching her to rope a steer properly when she'd insisted she needed to know how to do everything her father did. She thought about how the ranch house had felt emptier after he'd gone home each evening. How she'd found herself watching for him in the mornings. How her heart had done that strange little skip whenever he smiled at her. She'd been so focused on her grief, on survival, on keeping her head above water, that she hadn't let herself feel anything else. Hadn't let herself acknowledge the warmth that spread through her chest when he was near, or the way she felt safer when he was around, or how the world seemed a little less harsh when he was in it. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely audible. His other hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "So am I, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The train was slowing, its brakes beginning to squeal. The station master appeared from his office, ready to help passengers board. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed, one way or another. She looked up into Garrett's eyes, into that steady green gaze that had never lied to her, never let her down. She thought about getting on that train alone, starting over in a city where she knew no one except a distant aunt, building a life from nothing with no one to lean on. Then she thought about making that same journey with this man beside her, this man who was willing to leave everything he knew because he loved her. "My aunt is expecting one person," she said, and watched his face begin to fall before she continued. "We'll need to telegraph her from the next station and tell her to expect two." For a heartbeat, he just stared at her, as if unable to believe what he'd heard. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise, transforming him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You mean it?" His voice was muffled against her hair. "I mean it." She pulled back enough to look at him, her own smile trembling but real. "But Garrett, I need you to understand something. I'm not healed. I'm still grieving my father. I'm still angry about losing everything. I cannot promise you that I'll be easy to be around or that I won't have days where I'm difficult and sad and not the person you think I am." "I know exactly who you are," he said, his hands framing her face. "You're strong and stubborn and fierce and kind. You're the woman who nursed her mother through a long sickness without complaint, who ran a ranch alongside her father until the day he died, who never once, in all the hard times, lost her ability to see the good in people. You're the only woman I've ever loved, and I'll take the hard days right along with the good ones, for as long as you'll have me." The train had stopped now, steam hissing from its engine. The conductor was climbing down, calling out the station name. "We need to go," Zelda said. "Do you have anything, any luggage?" Garrett laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Not with me. I rode straight here from the mercantile. I've got what I'm wearing and the horse I rode in on. I suppose I should sell him, unless you think we can bring him on the train. I don't think the railroad allows horses in passenger cars." She was grinning now, unable to help herself, the absurdity and rightness of the situation hitting her all at once. "You really were willing to leave everything, weren't you? For you? In a heartbeat." He grabbed her carpetbag, tucking her hand through his arm. "Though I should probably send word to my employer that I won't be back, and I suppose I do have a few belongings in my room. Nothing that cannot be shipped if I write to someone." They were moving toward the train now, and Zelda felt as if she was floating, as if the platform beneath her feet was not quite solid. Everything had changed in the span of 10 minutes. She was still leaving Prescott, still starting over, but now she was not alone. Now she had someone walking beside her into the unknown. The conductor helped them aboard, and Garrett paid for his ticket with money he pulled from his pocket, counting it out carefully. Zelda realized with a start that it was probably everything he had. He was giving up not just his home but his savings, his security, everything, on nothing more than faith in her and what they might build together. They found seats in the passenger car, near a window. As Garrett stowed her bag overhead, Zelda looked out at Prescott, at the small town that had been her entire world. She could see the main street from here, the buildings she'd known since childhood, the mercantile where her mother used to buy fabric, the church where both her parents were buried, the road that led north toward what had been their ranch. She expected to feel sadness, regret, the tearing pain of leaving home. Instead, what she felt was something closer to relief, not because she was glad to go, but because she was not going alone. Because the man settling into the seat beside her had transformed this flight into something else entirely. An adventure. A beginning rather than an ending. Garrett reached over and took her hand again, and she laced her fingers through his, holding on tight. "No second thoughts?" he asked quietly. She turned from the window to look at him, really look at him. The strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose from where it had been broken years ago, the warmth in his eyes that had always been there if she'd only let herself see it. He was not the most handsome man she'd ever met, but he was good and steady and true, and he loved her. He'd said it plainly and without artifice, and she could see it in every line of his face. "No second thoughts," she said. "What about you?" "Not a one." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it made her throat tight. "Though I'll confess I'm terrified. I've never been farther west than Socorro. Don't know a thing about California except what I've read in newspapers." "Neither do I," Zelda admitted. "My aunt's letters are full of talk about the city and the harbor and fog rolling in from the ocean, but I cannot picture any of it. It might as well be a foreign country. Then we'll discover it together." He was still holding her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "We'll figure it out as we go." The train whistle blew, a long, clear note. The car lurched slightly as the engine engaged, and then they were moving, slowly at first but gathering speed. Prescott began to slide past the window, the buildings giving way to open land, scrub, brush, and distant mountains painted in the clear morning light. Zelda watched it go, her past receding with every turn of the wheels. She thought about her parents, about what they would have thought of this moment. Her mother, she thought, would have approved. Her mother had always liked Garrett, had commented more than once on what a good man he was. Her father had trusted him with their livelihood, which was perhaps the highest praise he could have given. Would they have wanted her to stay in Arizona, to fight for the ranch somehow, to cling to what they'd built? Or would they have wanted her to be happy, to find her own path, to build a life that was hers rather than an echo of theirs? She did not know. She would never know. But she chose to believe they would have wanted her to take this leap, to trust in the man beside her, to move forward rather than remaining frozen in grief. "Tell me something," she said, turning back to Garrett. "You said you've loved me for 3 years. When did you know?" He considered the question, a slight smile playing at his lips. "There was a day, spring of '81. You remember that mare we had, the chestnut with the white blaze, Copper? Of course I remember her. She was foaling and it was going badly. Your father was in town, and your mother was too sick to leave her bed. You came and found me, and we worked together for hours trying to help that mare. It was late, well past midnight, and we finally got the foal delivered, but the mare was exhausted and the baby wasn't nursing properly." Zelda did remember. It had been one of the hardest nights she could recall, fighting to save both animals. "You sat up with them the rest of the night," Garrett continued. "You sang to the mare, talked to her, encouraged her. And when the foal finally figured out how to nurse, right as the sun was coming up, you looked at me with tears streaming down your face and the biggest smile I'd ever seen. You were covered in hay and sweat and God knows what else, exhausted beyond words, and you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. That was when I knew." She remembered that smile, that moment of pure relief and joy when the foal had finally latched on and begun to drink. She'd been so tired she'd been almost giddy with it. She did not remember Garrett's expression, had been too focused on the animals to notice. But he'd been watching her. He'd been falling in love. "The foal was strong," she said softly. "We sold him the next year for a good price. Your father was proud of you for saving them. He told me so." Tears pricked at her eyes, sudden and sharp. "He did. He said you had more heart and grit than most men twice your age." Garrett's voice was gentle. "He said it more than once, Zelda. He was so proud of you. I hope you know that." She did not trust herself to speak, so she just nodded, blinking hard against the tears. The grief was still there, raw and real, but somehow Garrett's words eased it slightly. Her father had been a man of few words, especially about feelings. Knowing that he'd spoken well of her, that he'd been proud, mattered more than she could have explained. The train rolled on, carrying them east toward the territorial line, toward New Mexico, and then Kansas and Nebraska, and all the distance between Arizona and California. It would take days to make the journey, traveling across the country to catch a western line that would carry them to San Francisco. Days of sitting side by side, talking, learning each other in ways they'd never had the chance to before. "What about you?" Garrett asked after a while. When did you know? Zelda thought about it, really considered the question. When had she known she loved him? Or had she simply not let herself know until he'd forced the issue? "I don't think there was one moment," she said slowly. "I think it was 100 small moments. The way you always treated my parents with respect. How you gentled the horses instead of breaking them hard. The fact that you stayed even when we could barely pay you and never once complained or asked for more. How you looked at me sometimes when you thought I wasn't watching." "You noticed that," I noticed. She felt heat in her cheeks. "I just didn't let myself think about what it meant. After Mama died, I think I just closed off that part of myself. It hurt too much to feel anything, so I tried not to feel at all. And then Papa got sick, and there was no room for anything but taking care of him and trying to keep the ranch going. By the time he died, I was so numb I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. And now, she was on a train with a man who'd appended his entire life for her. A man who declared his love on a railway platform and then climbed aboard with nothing but the clothes on his back and faith in a future they'd build together. Now she was terrified and exhilarated and more alive than she'd felt in months. "Now I'm feeling everything at once," she admitted. "It's overwhelming." He squeezed her hand. "We don't have to rush anything. I meant what I said. I know you're grieving. I know you need time. I'm not expecting you to have all the answers right now. But you love me." She needed to hear it again to be sure it was real. "I love you." He said it simply, as if it was the easiest truth in the world. "I'll love you tomorrow and next week and next year. There's no hurry, Zelda. We have time." Time. Yes, they had that now. Days on this train and then a new life in California. Time to heal, time to grow, time to figure out what they were to each other beyond the confines of employer's daughter and hired hand. The morning wore on into afternoon. The conductor came through taking tickets, eyeing Garrett's dusty clothes but saying nothing. Other passengers dozed or read or stared out windows. The landscape changed gradually, the mountains giving way to higher desert, the colors shifting from gold to red to russet brown. They talked, at first in fits and starts and then more easily, about everything and nothing. Garrett told her about growing up in Texas, about his family's small farm and how he'd left at 16 to make his own way. How he'd worked ranches across Texas and New Mexico before ending up in Arizona. She told him about her childhood, about her mother teaching her to read using an old Bible and whatever books they could get. About learning to ride before she could properly walk, according to her father's telling of it. When evening came, the conductor announced they'd be stopping for the night in a small New Mexico town. The train would remain at the station, and passengers could either sleep aboard or seek lodging in town. Garrett and Zelda looked at each other, an unspoken question between them. "We should probably find a hotel," Zelda said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "It'll be more comfortable than trying to sleep sitting up." Garrett nodded, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Money. He was thinking about money, about how much a hotel would cost, about how little he had. "I have money," she said quietly. "Not a fortune, but enough. My aunt sent me train fare and a bit extra. We can afford a room. I don't want you paying my way. Then consider it a loan. You can pay me back when we're settled and you've found work." She stood as the train began to slow, reaching for her carpet bag. "Garrett, you gave up everything to come with me. The least I can do is help with expenses until we're on our feet." He looked like he wanted to argue, pride warring with practicality in his expression. Finally he nodded, standing as well. "All right, but I will pay you back. Every cent." The town was barely more than a wide spot in the tracks, but it had a hotel of sorts, a two-story building that looked like it had seen better days but was clean enough. The proprietor, a thin woman with sharp eyes, looked them over with obvious speculation. "One room or two?" she asked, her tone making clear what she thought of a young woman traveling with a man. Zelda felt her cheeks heat, but before she could answer, Garrett spoke up. "2 rooms, please. Adjoining if you have them." The woman's expression softened slightly. "We do. That'll be $1.50 for the night, both rooms." Garrett paid, using more of his dwindling funds, and accepted the keys. The rooms were small but serviceable, each with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. The door between them had a lock on both sides. "I'll leave this open a crack," Garrett said, demonstrating. "So if you need anything in the night, you just call out." "Thank you." She stood in the doorway between the rooms, suddenly awkward. They'd spent the entire day together, had shared more honest conversation than she'd had with anyone in months, but now she did not know what to do. What was the protocol when traveling with a man you'd only just acknowledged you might love? Garrett seemed to sense her uncertainty. He stepped closer, but not too close, respecting the invisible boundary between them. "Get some rest," he said gently. "It's been a long day and we have another long one tomorrow." "Garrett," she caught his hand as he started to turn away. "Thank you for everything, for coming with me. For loving me enough to do something this crazy." He lifted her hand to his lips again, that same tender gesture that made her heart skip. "Loving you isn't crazy. It's the sanest thing I've ever done." Then he was gone, the door between their rooms left slightly ajar, and she was alone for the first time all day. She sank down onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. So much had changed since this morning. This time yesterday, she'd been steeling herself to leave alone, to face an uncertain future with no one but a distant aunt for support. Now she had Garrett. Now she had someone who loved her, who'd proven it in the most dramatic way possible. It should have felt rushed, reckless. In many ways it was. She barely knew him, not really. They'd worked together, yes, but always with the careful distance of their different social positions. She was the owner's daughter, he was the hired man. There had always been that gulf between them, except now there wasn't. Now they were just two people on a train, heading toward a new life, with nothing between them but possibility. She undressed down to her chemise and crawled under the thin blanket, exhaustion pulling at her. Through the crack in the door she could hear the faint sounds of Garrett moving around in his own room. It was oddly comforting, knowing he was near. "Garrett," she called softly. "Yeah." His voice came back immediately, alert. "I'm glad you came." A pause, and then, "Me too. Sleep well, Zelda." "You too." She closed her eyes, and despite everything, despite the strangeness of the bed and the town and the situation, she fell asleep almost immediately and slept more soundly than she had in months. The next days took on a rhythm. They'd board the train each morning, sit together watching the country roll past, talk about everything under the sun. They'd stop at night, find lodging, always 2 rooms but always close. And slowly, carefully, they began to learn each other. Garrett told her about his dreams, about wanting someday to have his own small spread. Nothing grand but enough land for some cattle and horses. About how he loved the work of training horses, the patience and communication it required. She told him about her love of books, about how she'd always kept the ranch accounts, and how she had a head for numbers that her father had valued. about how she'd wanted to see more of the world but had never imagined she actually would. They talked about San Francisco, about what they might find there, about her aunt, who Zelda remembered as a stern woman with exacting standards, about what kind of work Garrett might find in a city so different from the ranch work he'd always done. "I'll find something," he said with quiet confidence. "I'm not afraid of hard work and I'm not proud. I'll do whatever needs doing to make a living." "My aunt might be able to help," Zelda said. "She mentioned in her letter that she knows a lot of people in the city. Business owners, shipping companies. Maybe she could ask around." Maybe. Garrett didn't sound entirely comfortable with the idea, and she understood. He didn't want to rely on her family's connections. He wanted to make his own way. They were somewhere in Kansas when Zelda finally asked the question that had been on her mind since that first morning. "What did you think would happen?" she said. "When you came to the station, I mean. Did you really think I'd say yes?" Garrett considered, his gaze on the flat plains rolling past the window. "Honestly, I had no idea. I just knew I had to try. I couldn't let you go without telling you how I felt. Even if you'd gotten on that train alone, at least you would have known. At least I wouldn't have spent the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to speak." "It was brave," she said softly, "what you did, putting yourself out there like that. I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified." He looked at her, a slight smile on his face. "Still do sometimes. This is all so new, we're making it up as we go along." "Is that bad?" "No." He reached over and took her hand as he'd taken to doing. The gesture was becoming familiar, comfortable. "I don't think it's bad at all. I think maybe the best things in life are the ones you cannot plan for." That night, they stopped in a larger town, one that actually had a telegraph office. Zelda sent the promised wire to her aunt, explaining that she was traveling with a companion and asking if there might be work for two rather than one. The reply came back within an hour, terse but not unkind. "Bring your friend. We'll sort it out." "She sounds like a woman of few words," Garrett observed, reading the telegram over Zelda's shoulder. "My mother said she was the practical one in the family. I think that means she doesn't suffer fools. Then I'd better make sure not to act the fool." They found a small restaurant near the hotel, one of the few amenities this town offered. Over plates of beef and potatoes, Zelda found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. Maybe it was the distance from Prescott, from all the memories and pain. Maybe it was the simple fact of having a future to look forward to rather than just surviving day by day. Or maybe it was the man across from her, who looked at her like she hung the moon and stars. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked, catching her staring. "I'm thinking about how strange life is. A week ago, I thought I knew exactly how my future would unfold. I'd go to San Francisco, work for my aunt, make a quiet life for myself. No complications, no risks, just existing. And now I have no idea what's going to happen, and somehow that doesn't terrify me the way it should." She set down her fork, meeting his eyes. "You've changed everything, Garrett. You know that, right? I hope I've changed it for the better." "You have." The words came out fierce, certain. "You've given me something to look forward to, something beyond just running away from grief." He reached across the table, his hand open, palm up, an invitation. She placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close around hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I know these aren't exactly normal circumstances, but once we get to San Francisco and get settled, I want to do this right. Call on you, bring you flowers, take you places. All the things a man should do when he's hoping to win a woman's heart." Her throat felt tight. "You've already won it." "Have I?" His voice was soft, hopeful. "I think you won it somewhere between a mare foaling on a spring night and a railway platform in Prescott." She smiled, feeling suddenly shy. "I just wasn't ready to admit it to myself." And now I'm ready." She squeezed his hand. "I cannot promise I won't have bad days. I cannot promise the grief won't swamp me sometimes, but I can promise that I'll try. I'll try to build this new life with you. I'll try to be the woman you seem to think I am." "You already are that woman," Garrett said firmly. "You don't have to try to be anything other than yourself." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, hands still joined across the table. When they left the restaurant, Garrett offered her his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. The night was cool, stars brilliant in the vast prairie sky, so different from the desert sky of home but beautiful in its own way. Back at the hotel, at the door between their rooms, Garrett paused. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, the question almost formal. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Yes." He stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. Then he bent his head and pressed his lips to hers, gentle and questioning. She'd been kissed before, fumbling experiments with a boy when she was 16, but this was different. This was a kiss between adults, between two people who knew what they wanted. She leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her palms. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark. "I've wanted to do that for 3 years." Was it worth the wait, every single day of it? He kissed her forehead, tender. "Good night, Zelda. Good night." She floated into her room, barely aware of undressing, of crawling into bed. Her lips still tingled. Her heart was racing. Everything felt new and bright and possible. The next days passed in a blur of travel and talk and slowly deepening connection. They crossed into Colorado, the landscape changing again, mountains rising in the distance. At each stop, Garrett would help her down from the train, would carry her bag, would make sure she had what she needed. Small courtesies, but they mattered. And each night before they parted to their separate rooms, he would kiss her. Sometimes just a soft press of lips, sometimes deeper, his arms around her, her hands in his hair. But he never pushed for more, never suggested anything improper. He was courting her, she realized. Even in these strange circumstances, he was trying to do things right. They reached Denver, where they had to change trains, catching one that would take them north and then west through the mountains to California. The journey through the Rockies was breathtaking, the train climbing through passes that seemed impossible, the world dropping away on either side. Zelda pressed her face to the window like a child, marveling at the sheer stone faces, the pine forests, the occasional glimpse of snow even in summer. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Garrett was watching her rather than the scenery. "Yes, it is." She caught him looking and felt her cheeks heat. "The mountains, I mean. I know what you meant." But he was smiling, that private smile that had become familiar. Somewhere in Nevada, as the train descended from the mountains into high desert again, Garrett fell quiet. Zelda, who had learned to read his moods, touched his arm. "What's wrong?" He shook his head. "Nothing's wrong, I'm just thinking." "About," he hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "About what happens when we get to San Francisco. About meeting your aunt, about finding work, about where we'll live, about what people will think when they see us together." "Why would it matter what people think?" "Because you're a respectable young woman and I'm nobody. I'm a cowboy with no money and no prospects beyond my willingness to work hard. Your aunt is a successful businesswoman. She's going to take one look at me and wonder what you're doing with someone like me." Zelda felt a flash of anger, not at him but at the unfairness of a world that would judge a man's worth by his bank account rather than his character. "My aunt is practical, but she's not a snob," she said firmly. "My mother came from the same family, and she married a rancher. Not a wealthy one, either. She married my father because she loved him, because he was a good man. I have to believe my aunt understands that what matters is character, not money. I hope you're right. And even if she doesn't, it doesn't matter. Zelda turned in her seat to face him fully. Garrett, you gave up everything to come with me. You've proven yourself in every way that counts. Whatever happens in San Francisco, we'll face it together. If my aunt doesn't like it, we'll figure something else out. Some of the tension eased from his shoulders. Together. Together, she confirmed. The train rolled on, carrying them inexorably west toward the ocean and a city neither of them had ever seen. The closer they got, the more Zelda felt a mix of anticipation and nerves. This was it. This was the new life she'd been running toward, but it looked so different now than it had when she'd planned it alone. They reached Sacramento, then caught the final train to San Francisco. The landscape changed again, becoming greener, with rolling hills and a gentleness to the air that was nothing like the harsh desert she'd left behind. And then, finally, after days of travel, the conductor was calling out their destination. San Francisco. Last stop, San Francisco. Zelda's stomach clenched with sudden nerves. Beside her, Garrett sat up straighter, his hand finding hers. "Ready?" he asked. She took a breath. "As I'll ever be." The station was enormous, bigger than any building Zelda had ever seen. People swarmed everywhere, a chaos of movement and noise that made her dizzy. She stood on the platform with her carpetbag, Garrett beside her, and tried to find her bearings. "Miss Fairmont?" She turned to find a woman approaching, tall and slim with dark hair gone silver at the temples. She was dressed elegantly in a way that spoke of money and taste, and her eyes were sharp as she looked Zelda over. Aunt Margaret, the same. Her aunt's gaze moved to Garrett, assessing. "And you must be the companion mentioned in the telegram." "Garrett Ashford, madam." Garrett removed his hat, his posture respectful. "I'm grateful for your willingness to help. We'll see about that." But Margaret's voice was not unkind. "Come along, both of you. I have a carriage waiting." San Francisco was like nothing Zelda had imagined. Hills rising and falling, streets packed with carriages and people, buildings that seemed impossibly tall. The air smelled of salt and fog and something indefinably urban. It was overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once. Margaret's house was in a respectable part of the city, a tall, narrow building painted white. Inside, it was elegantly furnished, everything neat and orderly. "You'll stay here until we figure out living arrangements," Margaret said, leading them into a parlor. "Zelda, there's a room prepared for you on the second floor. Mr. Ashford, I'm afraid the only other space available is the small room in the attic. It's not much, but it's clean." "That's more than generous, madam," Garrett said. "I appreciate it." Margaret rang a bell, and a housekeeper appeared to show them to their rooms. Zelda followed the woman up the stairs, acutely aware of Garrett behind her, of the strangeness of this new place. Her room was lovely, far nicer than anything she'd had at the ranch. A large bed with a proper mattress, a wardrobe, a writing desk by the window. Through the glass she could see the city spreading out below and in the distance a glimpse of water. "We'll have dinner at 7, the housekeeper said. "Miss Margaret likes punctuality." Alone in the room, Zelda sank down onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. They'd made it. After days of travel, they were here. Now came the hard part, building a life in this strange new place. A soft knock at her door made her look up. Garrett stood in the doorway, looking as out of place as she felt in his dusty cowboy clothes amid all this elegance. "Your aunt wants to speak with me," he said. "Alone." Zelda's stomach clenched. Now, he tried to smile, but she could see the nerves in his eyes. "Wish me luck." She wanted to go with him, to defend him, to make sure Margaret understood how good he was. But she knew that would only make things worse. This was something Garrett had to face himself. "Good luck," she whispered. He left, and she was alone with her worries and the strange quiet of this unfamiliar house. Downstairs, Garrett followed Margaret into a small study lined with books. She gestured him to a chair and took one opposite, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. "So," she said, "tell me about your relationship with my niece." Garrett had faced down ornery bulls and broken broncos without flinching, but this elegant woman with her cool gaze made him nervous. Still, he met her eyes steadily. "I love her," he said simply. "I worked for her father for 4 years. I watched her nurse her mother, then her father. I saw her hold herself together when everything fell apart, and I knew that I couldn't let her leave for California without telling her how I felt. And so you followed her here with no money, no prospects, and no plan beyond the vague hope that I might help you." It was a statement, not a question, and it did not sound impressed. "I followed her because a life without her isn't one I want," Garrett said quietly. "You're right that I don't have much to offer. I'm a ranch hand. It's all I've ever been. But I'm good at it, and I'm willing to work hard at anything else I can find. I'm not asking for charity, madam. I'll earn my keep, and I'll earn the right to court your niece properly if she'll have me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying him. "My sister married for love," she said finally. "Against our father's wishes, she married a cowboy with big dreams and no capital. She spent her life on a hardscrabble ranch in Arizona, working herself to the bone." Garrett's heart sank. This was it. This was where she told him he wasn't good enough, but Margaret continued. She was happy. Every letter she sent radiated joy, even in the hard times. She loved that man, and he loved her, and they built a good life together. When she died content. Her eyes softened slightly. "I want the same for Zelda. I want her to be happy. The question is, are you the man who can make her so?" "I'm the man who will spend every day trying," Garrett said. "I cannot promise wealth or ease, but I can promise that I'll love her, support her, stand by her through whatever comes. That's all I have to offer, but I offer it freely." Another long silence. Then Margaret nodded as if coming to a decision. "There's a man I know," she said. "He runs a stable, provides horses and carriages for hire. He's getting older, needs help with the heavier work. The pay isn't much to start, but there's a small apartment above the stable that comes with the job. If you can prove yourself, he might make you a partner eventually." Hope flared in Garrett's chest. "You'd recommend me? I'll give you an introduction. What you do with it is up to you." She stood, and Garrett scrambled to his feet. "Dinner is at 7. We'll discuss details then. And Mr. Ashford, if you hurt my niece, there's no place in this city you can hide where I won't find you." Despite everything, Garrett almost smiled. He liked this woman. "Understood, madam." Upstairs, he found Zelda pacing her room, worry written all over her face. She spun when he knocked, rushing to the door. "What did she say?" "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." He pulled her into his arms, relief making him hold her tight. "She's going to help me find work. There's a position at a stable with an apartment included." "Really?" Zelda pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide. "She's going to help. She's giving me a chance to prove myself." He touched her face, tracing the curve of her cheek. "That's all I needed. A chance." She kissed him then, throwing her arms around his neck, and he held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the rightness of it all settle into his bones. They'd made it. Against all odds, they were here together with a future spreading out before them. Dinner that night was slightly awkward, Garrett hyper-aware of which fork to use, of his rough hands against the fine linen. But Margaret asked him intelligent questions about ranching, about horses, about his experience. And as they talked, he saw her expression gradually shift from skeptical to considering to something approaching approval. "You know your business," she said eventually. "Thomas, the man who runs the stable, will appreciate that. I'll take you to meet him tomorrow." The meeting went better than Garrett could have hoped. Thomas was a weathered man in his 60s, his hands gnarled with arthritis. He walked Garrett through the stable, pointing out the horses, explaining the business. By the end of the tour, they'd shaken on it. Garrett would start the next day. The apartment above the stable was small, just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen, but it was clean and private. That evening, Garrett stood in the middle of it, trying to picture a life here. It was so different from anything he'd known, this city life. But it was a start. It was possibility. A knock at the door revealed Zelda, with Margaret standing behind her. "My niece insisted on seeing your new home," Margaret said dryly. "I've agreed to give you 2 exactly 15 minutes, unchaperoned, to talk. Then we're leaving, and everything will be conducted properly from here on out." "Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, madam," they said in unison, like chastened children. Margaret retreated down the stairs, and suddenly Garrett and Zelda were alone, truly alone, for the first time since arriving in San Francisco. "It's perfect," Zelda said, looking around. "It's small, but it's yours. It could be ours." The words were out before he could stop them. "I mean, not now. I know we need to do this right, but someday, if you'd want, it could be ours." She turned to him, her eyes bright. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Garrett's heart was pounding. This wasn't how he'd planned it. He'd meant to wait to court her properly for months, to save up money for a ring. But standing here in this small apartment, with the woman he loved looking at him like that, he couldn't hold back. He dropped to one knee. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I don't have much of anything except a job that starts tomorrow and more love than I know what to do with. But Zelda Fairmont, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not today, not next week, but when we're ready. When we've built something here worth building on. When we can stand before a preacher and mean every word we say." Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." He stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion of the past weeks, all the fear and hope and love. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." "I could never regret it." She kissed him again, soft and sweet. "You're the best thing that's happened to me, Garrett Ashford." Margaret's voice floated up the stairs. "Your 15 minutes are up." They broke apart, laughing, giddy with happiness. Hand in hand they descended the stairs to where Margaret waited, her expression knowing. "You're engaged," she said. "It wasn't a question." "We are," Zelda confirmed, lifting her chin as if daring her aunt to object. But Margaret just smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "Good. It's about time. Now we have planning to do. A wedding to arrange, a proper one. And in the meantime, you two will conduct yourselves appropriately. No more unsupervised visits." "Yes, madam," Garrett said, but he couldn't stop grinning. The next months were a whirlwind. Garrett threw himself into work at the stable, proving himself so quickly that Thomas began teaching him the business end of things, how to manage accounts and deal with customers. Zelda started working for Margaret, keeping the books for her import business and proving to have a natural head for commerce. Garrett would call on her properly 3 evenings a week, sitting in Margaret's parlor under the woman's watchful eye, talking about their days, making plans for the future. On Sundays, they'd walk together through the city, Margaret trailing at a discreet distance as chaperone, exploring their new home. San Francisco grew on them. The fog that rolled in from the bay, the steep hills, the mix of cultures and languages. It was nothing like Arizona, but it had its own beauty, its own rhythm. They were building a life here together. 6 months after arriving in California, on a clear December day with the city spread out below and the bay sparkling in the distance, Zelda Fairmont married Garrett Ashford in a small church with Margaret and Thomas, and a handful of friends they'd made in attendance. Zelda wore a simple dress of cream silk that Margaret had insisted on buying. Garrett wore a new suit, the first he'd ever owned. And when the preacher asked if he took this woman to be his wife, Garrett's "I do" rang out clear and certain, no hesitation, no doubt. Their wedding night was spent in the apartment above the stable, which Zelda had spent the past weeks making into a home. She'd sewn curtains, bought a few pieces of simple furniture, filled a vase with flowers. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Garrett carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of their front room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Home," she repeated, and realized it was true. This place with this man was home in a way Prescott had never been after her parents died. This was where she belonged. That night, they came together as husband and wife with tenderness and love and a joy that felt almost sacred. And later, lying in their small bed with Garrett's arms around her and his steady heartbeat under her ear, Zelda thought about how strange life was. How a year ago she'd been drowning in grief, seeing no future beyond survival. And now she was here, married to a man she loved beyond measure, building a life that was theirs to shape. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked softly, his hand stroking through her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "You, more than words can say." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but love to offer. You offered everything that mattered." She tilted her face up to kiss him. "And I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." The years unfolded like pages in a book. Garrett's hard work paid off when Thomas, having no children of his own, offered to sell him the stable for a fair price, with payments spread over time. They struggled at first, scrimping and saving, but the business grew. Garrett's skill with horses and Zelda's business acumen proved a formidable combination. 2 years into their marriage, their first child was born, a boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. They named him William, after Zelda's father. Margaret, who had become a doting aunt despite her stern exterior, held her grandnephew with tears in her eyes. "Your parents would be so proud," she told Zelda. "Look at what you've built here." Zelda looked at her son, at her husband standing beside her with wonder written all over his face, at the life they'd carved out in this city by the bay. "We built it together," she said. "That's what makes it worth having." The stable thrived. They hired help, expanded, bought better horses. Within 5 years, Ashford Stables was known as one of the finest in San Francisco. They moved to a small house on a hill, with room for their growing family. Another child came, a daughter with dark hair and her father's smile, whom they named Alice after Zelda's mother. Garrett would sometimes stand at the window of their home, looking out at the city lights, and marvel at how far they'd come. From a cowboy with nothing to his name, to a business owner, to a husband and father. All because he'd found the courage to speak his heart on a railway platform in Arizona. "What are you thinking about?" Zelda would ask, coming up behind him, her arms sliding around his waist. "About that morning at the train station," he'd say, covering her hands with his. "About how close I came to not saying anything, about how different our lives would be if I'd let fear win." "But you didn't." She'd rest her head against his shoulder. "You were brave enough to ask me not to go without you. Best decision I ever made." Years turned into decades. Their children grew, married, had children of their own. The business passed to William, who ran it with the same dedication his father had. Margaret lived to a ripe old age, dying peacefully in her sleep at 85, secure in the knowledge that her sister's daughter had found happiness. Garrett and Zelda aged together, their hair going silver, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, but their love never dimming. They'd weathered hardships, celebrated joys, built a legacy together. And through it all, they never forgot where they'd started. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at their home for a celebration. William stood to make a toast, raising his glass high. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who taught us that love is a choice you make every day. That courage means speaking your heart even when you're terrified. That home isn't a place, it's the person you choose to walk through life beside." He looked at his parents, at the way they sat side by side, hands clasped, still so clearly in love after half a century. "Thank you for showing us what real love looks like." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Garrett turned to Zelda, this woman he'd loved for more than 50 years, who was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "No regrets?" He asked softly, the same question he'd asked so many times over the years. "Not a single one," she answered, the same answer she always gave. "You're my greatest adventure, Garrett Ashford. And you're my home, Zelda Ashford." He kissed her, gentle and sweet, and around them their family celebrated the love that had built them all. When Garrett was 78 and Zelda 76, he fell ill. A sickness in his lungs that the doctors said came from too many years breathing stable dust. He fought it as long as he could, but eventually even his stubborn strength began to fail. In his final days, he lay in their bed with Zelda beside him, just as they'd slept for 56 years. Their children came to say goodbye, their grandchildren, even a few great-grandchildren. But after they'd gone, it was just the two of them as it had been at the beginning. "I'm sorry," Garrett whispered, his voice weak. "I wanted more time." "We had a lifetime," Zelda said, tears streaming down her face but her voice steady. "We had more than most people ever dream of." "You gave me everything, Garrett. Everything that mattered." "Don't go without me," he said, an echo of those words from so long ago, from a railway platform in Arizona when their life together was just beginning. She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his lips. "Never. I'll be right behind you when my time comes, and we'll find each other again, just like we did the first time." He smiled, that smile that had won her heart 56 years ago. "I'll be waiting." He died that night peacefully with his hand in hers. And though Zelda's heart broke, she did not regret a single moment they'd had together. How could she? He'd given her the greatest gift imaginable, a life lived fully, loved completely, with no words left unspoken. Zelda lived another 3 years, surrounded by the family they'd built together. She told their story often, to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, wanting them to understand how love was both simple and profound, how one brave moment could change everything, how the best things in life were worth risking everything for. On a spring morning in 1939, Zelda Fairmont Ashford passed away quietly in her sleep, in the same bed where her husband had died 3 years before. She was 79 years old, and she went with a smile on her face, as if she'd seen something wonderful just before the end. At her funeral, William told the story one more time, of how his mother had been leaving Prescott forever, alone and grieving, when his father had found the courage to say 5 words that changed both their lives. "Don't go without me." "They built something beautiful together," William said, looking at the gathered family, at the legacy of love his parents had left behind. "They showed us that real love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice, a commitment, a promise kept every single day." And they kept that promise for 56 years. They buried her beside Garrett, in a cemetery overlooking the bay, with a simple headstone that bore both their names and the dates of their births and deaths. But beneath that, by William's instruction, was carved a single line, "Together always." And in the hearts of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, In the stories told and retold around family tables, Garrett and Zelda lived on, not as perfect people, but as real ones. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life together through courage and love and steadfast commitment. Who'd proven that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the bravery to speak your heart, even when you're terrified. Their story became family legend, passed down through generations. Of the cowboy who'd ridden hard to reach a railway platform. Of the grieving woman who'd said yes to an impossible proposal. Of two people who'd taken a leap of faith together and had landed in a life more beautiful than either could have imagined. Years after their deaths, one of their great-granddaughters, facing her own crossroads, would stand at a station much like the one in Prescott and remember the story. She'd think about courage, about taking chances, about speaking your heart even when the outcome is uncertain. And she'd make her own brave choice, continuing the legacy they'd begun. Because that was the real gift Garrett and Zelda had given their family. Not wealth or property or business success, though those things had mattered. The real gift was the example they'd set. The proof that love, real love, was worth risking everything for. That speaking your truth, even when you're terrified, could open doors to futures you'd never imagined. That one moment of courage, one man asking a woman not to leave without him, had rippled out through time and generations. It had built a family, a business, a legacy. It had created love stories that echoed through decades, each one different but all of them rooted in that first brave choice. On what would have been their 70th wedding anniversary, the family gathered at their gravesite. Dozens of people, all descended from or connected to that first union. William, now elderly himself, placed flowers on the graves of his parents. "Thank you," he said simply, speaking to the stone as if they could hear, "for showing us the way, for being brave enough to start this family, this legacy, for loving each other so well that we all learned what love should look like." The sun was setting over the bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. And in that moment, with their family gathered around, it felt as if Garrett and Zelda were there too, not in body but in spirit, in the love that surrounded their resting place, in the family they'd created, in the story that would never end as long as someone was there to tell it, because some love stories don't end with death. Some love stories echo through eternity, touching lives not yet lived, inspiring choices not yet made. And the story of Garrett and Zelda Ashford, of the cowboy who'd risked everything and the woman who'd been brave enough to say yes, was one of those stories. It had started on a railway platform in Prescott, Arizona, in 1883, with 5 words that changed 2 lives forever. "Don't go without me." And in the end, they never did. Through 56 years of marriage, through all the joys and sorrows and ordinary moments that made up a life, they walked together. And when death finally parted them, it was only for a handful of years before they were reunited again, wherever souls go when bodies fail. Their story was complete. Their circle closed. But the love they'd built, the family they'd created, the example they'd set, that lived on. In every wedding toast, in every story told around the dinner table, in every moment when someone in their family found the courage to speak their heart, Garrett and Zelda were there. They had left the world far richer than they'd found it. Not through wealth or fame or grand achievements, but through something simpler and far more profound. They'd loved each other well. They'd built a life together worth living. And they'd shown everyone who knew them that real love, the kind that lasts, was always worth the risk. That was their legacy. That was their gift. And it would echo through generations long after everyone who'd known them personally was gone, because some truths are eternal. Some love stories are timeless. And some choices, made in moments of pure courage, ripple out through history in ways that can never be fully measured. The story of Garrett and Zelda Ashford was one of those stories. It had started with a train, a platform, and 5 brave words. It had grown into a lifetime of love, a family of descendants, a legacy that would never die. And at its heart was the simplest and most profound truth of all. That love, when chosen consciously and nurtured daily, could transform not just 2 lives but generations. That speaking your heart, even in fear, was always worth the risk. That together was always better than alone. They had understood that from the beginning. From that first moment when Garrett had said, "Don't go without me," and Zelda had said yes. They'd understood that whatever lay ahead, they wanted to face it side by side. And they'd kept that promise, through thick and thin, for better and worse, until death did them part. And now, their story told, their lives complete, they rested together overlooking the bay and the city they'd made their home. Together as they'd always been. Together as they'd always be. 2 souls who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful, who'd loved well and been loved in return. Their story was a love story. The kind the Wild West rarely saw but desperately needed. The kind that proved that even in hard times, in rough places, love could flourish. That 2 people, given courage and commitment, could build a life worth living and a legacy worth leaving. Garrett and Zelda Ashford had done that. They'd started with nothing but love and hope, and they'd built an empire of the heart that would last long after empires of money and power had crumbled to dust. They'd proven that the greatest adventures weren't found in grand gestures or dramatic events, but in the daily choice to love someone through all seasons, all trials, all joys. That was their story. That was their truth. And it would live forever in the hearts of all who heard it, a testament to the transforming power of love, the importance of courage, and the beauty of 2 lives lived fully, together. From that first brave moment on a railway platform to the final peaceful rest in a cemetery overlooking the sea.